The man known to history as Hideki Tojo was born on the 30th of December 1884 in the Japanese capital Tokyo. His father, Hidenori Tojo, whose ancestors came from the noble samurai caste, was a lieutenant general in the Imperial Japanese Army and served in various conflicts during his career, such as the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, when the Japanese army crushed an uprising of disaffected samurai, as well as the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, of which he helped to write a history, before retiring in 1907. His mother, Chitose Tojo, was the daughter of a Buddhist priest, which, combined with her husband's profession as a soldier, made the family socially respectable. Chitose also parented 2 other sons with Hidenori, of which Hideki was the youngest. Young Tojo was born at the dawn of one of the most transformative periods in Japanese history, as the country had, from the beginning of the 17th century, been ruled by a military government known as the Tokugawa shogunate, that was ruled by a de facto dictator known as the shogun in an era that is now referred to as the Edo or Tokugawa period. The shoguns had ruled Japan since the 12th century, when they effectively replaced the country's emperors as rulers, and in the centuries that followed, various feudal lords known as daimyos vied with one another for the title of shogun in a number of bloody wars, most notably during the Sengoku Jida period that ended with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate and the beginning of the Edo period in 1603. The Edo period itself saw Japan adopt a strict isolationist foreign policy, whereby all overseas influences were prohibited and restricted. In addition, the government demanded that its population adhere to traditional Japanese ways of life. Despite this, the Japanese economy experienced steady growth during this time, and Japanese art and culture were encouraged and, as a result, flourished. However, this period of isolationism and tradition effectively turned Japan into a time capsule. And when, by the 19th century, it was evident that the country lagged way behind countries such as the United States, Russia, and Great Britain, the then shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu opened up Japan to Western trade. These policies were met with fierce resistance from the country's traditionalist daimyos and samurai, particularly those in regions such as Satsuma and Choshu in the south of Japan, who were known as shishi, meaning men of high purpose, who then rose up against the Tokugawa shogunate, after the then Japanese Emperor Komei broke with convention and ordered the expulsion of all Europeans in 1863. These uprisings came to nothing, however, as Tokugawa Ieyasu maintained his control over Japan's government. Then, seeing that an overthrow of power was impossible, the shishi sought to combine traditional Japanese culture with Western technologies. After embracing this new philosophy, both Satsuma and Choshu, now armed with Western weaponry, formed a pact that is now known as the Sacho Alliance, which drove back the shogun forces in 1866, eventually forcing the new shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu to resign, although for a time he retained a degree of power and influence. Despite this victory, both Satsuma and Choshu then demanded a full restoration of the emperor to power, and, enraged by this, the armies of the Tokugawa and Sacho alliance then fought one another in the Boshin War from 1868 to 1869, in which the Tokugawa shogunate was ultimately defeated, and the Emperor Meiji was restored to power. Afterwards, he moved his seat of government to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, seizing the lands and holdings of the Japanese daimyos. The move effectively centralized power and marked the beginning of the Empire of Japan. This Meiji Restoration of 1868 was one of the most important events in the history of Japan, and although the Emperor Meiji had been restored as ruler, as he was still a boy, real power now lay in the hands of the samurai, who, over the coming years, sought to transform Japan into a modern nation by trading with Western powers such as France, Russia, the United States, and Britain. These new trade networks sparked a revolutionary metamorphosis within Japan, as it quickly changed from an insular feudal state into a modern world power in a matter of decades. its military, which had been comprised of armies of professional samurai under the command of regional daimyos, was replaced gradually with a conscripted peasant army of rifle-armed soldiers, who were under the direct control of the country's centralized government. This perhaps inevitably caused resentment amongst Japanese traditionalist samurai, who believed the country was changing for the worse, and so it wasn't long before uprisings broke out, such as the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, who, after leading a valiant campaign against the modern imperial army, was finally killed at the Battle of Shiroyama on the 24th of September 1877, in which he led his army of 500 samurai against a force of 30,000 government troops, earning him the posthumous title of the last true samurai. The Satsuma Rebellion also marked the ultimate end of the feudal era of Japan. However, the sheer heroism and warrior spirit Saigo Takamori showed during the uprising soon elevated him to near legendary status within Japan, until he was later posthumously pardoned by Emperor Meiji in 1889. As the sun set on the 19th century, many within the country began to question the wisdom of abandoning traditional Japanese values in favor of Western culture. This traditional sentiment then began to manifest itself over the coming decades as the influence of the samurai, as well as their Bushido moral code, re-emerged within the Japanese national consciousness as powerful lobbies within the country sought to turn it into a militaristic state whose primary goal was excellence in warfare by twisting and changing the samurai warrior code to suit their nationalistic political ends. Bushido, formed from the two words bushi, meaning warrior, and do, meaning the way or path, describes a moral code of conduct encompassing frugality, loyalty to one's lord and the emperor, martial skill in battle, and honor until death, that was used by those who we today refer to as samurai, although in Japan itself these legendary warriors are simply known as bushi. Immediately after the Meiji Restoration, Japan's new centralized government, as well as its military, had no need of the customs of the past, and over the next decade the country embarked on a period of territorial expansion as it occupied the Ryukyu Islands south of Japan in 1879, which included Okinawa, and then in the 1890s seized control over Korea as well as Taiwan following the First Sino-Japanese War, in which the modern Japanese army soundly defeated the Chinese on the Korean peninsula. This expansion marked the beginning of an increase in the Japanese sphere of influence in East Asia that would in time bring it into direct competition with the Western powers, who, ironically, had helped the country to modernize over the preceding decade. As well as Japan's newfound military prominence, after the emperor's restoration, the Meiji Constitution was proclaimed in 1889, establishing a new system of governance in which the emperor was the supreme leader, under whom a cabinet of ministers headed by a prime minister was created to form and enact policies, all of whom were in turn appointed on the basis of advice from an unelected privy council, who advised the emperor, who could ratify or reject any policy he wished. Despite the fact that the emperor was head of state and had the final say in all official affairs, the Japanese monarch increasingly took a back seat in the governance of the country, whilst the prime minister ran the government. However, as the cabinet and prime minister did not have to be elected in the Western style, the constitution was open to interference and manipulation. For example, if a certain political group seized control of the Privy Council that appointed the Prime Minister and Cabinet, they would not only effectively control the emperor, but also prevent any other political group from entering government. As well as this, the Constitution also allowed the creation of a House of Peers and a House of Representatives, the former of which was made of the country's nobility, who by and large held their positions for life. Members of the House of Representatives were elected by the wealthiest 1% of the Japanese population. In contrast, the electorate was widening with the introduction of universal male suffrage in 1925, although women were not allowed to vote in Japan until after the Second World War. Both of these houses had the right to put forward legislation, However, suggestions from the House of Representatives had to be passed by the House of Peers, the country's cabinet, prime minister, and emperor before becoming law. And as the cabinet and prime minister of Japan were appointed by the emperor and his advisors, these houses in effect had little say over the direction of the country. It was this system that, given Japan's increasing reverence and adherence to military tradition, eventually allowed powerful militarists to take control of the Japanese government. As each of the emperor's cabinet ministers and their departments were only accountable to the monarch, there was a tendency towards friction and even violence at the top of the Japanese state, as vying factions, particularly within the military, would fight with one another for control of the emperor's privy council. This, in time, would lead to the rise of career soldiers such as Hideki Tojo to lead the Japanese nation. As descendants of samurai, the Tojo family still retained a degree of prestige during this period, and it was because of this, combined with the new Meiji education system which prioritized military training for young boys, that young Hideki was schooled in the art of warfare from an early age. He and his classmates would undergo military-style drills, and were taught above all else that war was the most noble of arts, and that the emperor was an earth-bound god, whose will must be obeyed above all else. It is therefore perhaps no surprise that this strict and traditional system of education shaped young Hideki into a stern, humorless child who was extremely confident in his opinions and who would regularly get into fights with his fellow students, especially as martial arts were to be admired and encouraged. There was no place in the Meiji system of education for weaklings or cowards. It was also said of Tojo that he was an incredibly hard worker, despite exhibiting average intelligence, and later in his life, Hideki would often state that, "I am just an ordinary man, possessing no shining talents. Anything I have achieved, I owe to my capacity for hard work and never giving up." After completing his early education, in 1899 at the age of 15, Tojo Hideki entered Army Cadet School, where he would for the next 7 years be inculcated in methods and doctrines of the Imperial Japanese Army's officer corps, in which young men were trained to almost Spartan levels of discipline, self-control, and willpower that were designed to produce men who knew no fear and would obey any order without question. Hideki seems to have been ideally suited to this strict regime, as after all he was neither creative nor imaginative, but instead possessed a great capacity of hard work and self-discipline that saw him advance rapidly through cadet school and on into the army itself, where he soon became renowned for his eye for detail and methodical nature. At the time of Tojo's graduation into the Japanese army, the country was emerging victorious from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 that had seen the land of the rising sun win what was formerly Russian territory on mainland China. Despite emerging from the conflict as victors, the widespread sentiment across the country was that Japan had been betrayed and forced into an unsatisfactory peace by the American President Theodore Roosevelt at the Treaty of Portsmouth, a U.S. shipyard in Maine, where the peace agreement had been ratified. The reason for the nationwide outrage within Japan was that one of the top priorities of the war had been to seize portions of Siberia from Russia, and so the country being rewarded with only a small parcel of land on a Chinese peninsula was seen as unsatisfactory. The perceived meddling of the US president ignited a long-standing hatred and mistrust of the Americans across Japan and within Hideki Tojo himself. Further resentment against America within Japan was brought to the surface in 1924 when the United States Congress passed the Asian Exclusion Act that prevented all Asians from settling within the United States, prompting Tojo to write at the time that Asians would never be seen as equals within America, and that the people of Japan would need to be strong to secure their place in the world. In 1909, Tojo was married to Katsuko Ito, with whom he would go on to parent 3 sons and 4 daughters, who he would bring up in the same fastidious manner that he himself had experienced during his own childhood, evidence of which can be found in the fact that when his offspring were ill, both Hideki and his wife would keep detailed diaries on the children's condition, in which temperature, dietary intake, and bowel movements were all recorded in detail. After a short period with the Japanese army in Siberia, aiding its intervention in the Russian Civil War, Tojo, now a captain, was sent for further training to Germany in 1919, as the two nations had enjoyed close ties despite the fact Japan had fought on the side of the Allies during World War I, and after the conflict gained possession of a number of German islands in the Pacific Ocean, as well as the Shandong region on the eastern coast of China. Shandong was given back to the Chinese in 1922 under the supervision of the United States, which caused yet more distrust and anger across Japan. Whilst in Germany, Tojo became acquainted with the country's military practices, and despite the fact its armed forces had been greatly reduced as a consequence of the Versailles Treaty, he claimed afterwards that he had been impressed by the German population's courage despite the hardships they were incurring, but above all remarked that the discipline and sheer quality of the officer corps of the German army was something that Japan should seek to emulate. During the fallout from the armistice of World War I, Japan became a member of the League of Nations, which was founded in January of 1920 and had been formed by the American President Woodrow Wilson in an effort to secure peace for future generations by means of an international body that was designed to police the world and mediate in disputes. During the formation of the League of Nations, Japan had asked that all races should be treated as equals. However, this move was rejected by the other major powers, particularly those with empires, as the move would inevitably have resulted in countries such as France and Britain being forced to treat their colonial subjects as equal citizens, which at this time was unthinkable to them. Shortly afterwards, in 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty was formally agreed between Britain, France, the United States, Italy, and Japan, which restricted the number of capital ships or battleships each nation could construct over the coming years. This was designed to prevent the kind of naval arms race that had been seen in the lead-up to World War I. This treaty was controversial, to say the least, within the Japanese government and military, as both had previously planned to build a fleet 70% of the size of the American Navy, which was the minimum number that was deemed necessary to defeat the Americans, who the Japanese now saw as their main rival in the Pacific theater. The reason for needing such a large fleet was that military planners within Japan correctly saw that America would be able to build more ships at a faster pace than the Japanese in the event of an outbreak of hostilities. Therefore, it was agreed that having as large a navy as possible at the outbreak of war was desirable, as Japan's only hope of victory would lie in delivering a speedy knockout blow against the United States Pacific Fleet before its Atlantic Fleet could reinforce it. This strategy effectively remained unchanged for the next 20 years, as in the lead-up to World War II, Japan hoped to gain a speedy naval victory over the United States. In the meantime, and despite the resistance of the Japanese Navy, the Washington Naval Conference was convened, with all signatories agreeing to limit the tonnage and numbers of their battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. Before returning home in 1922, Tojo crossed the Atlantic to the United States and embarked on a cross-country rail journey from east to west that formed the basis of his first and last visit to America, and after returning home, he stated that he thought Americans to be soft, selfish people who were far more interested in wine, women, and song than the more disciplined Japanese populace. The early 1920s marked the period in Japanese history in which the country's military began to hold greater sway over the governance of the country, which was in part caused by a severe downturn in the country's economy that was compounded by its suffering a colossal natural disaster in 1923 in the shape of the Kanto earthquake near Tokyo with a magnitude of 7.9, which killed nearly 150,000 people. In the aftermath, martial law was declared as looting, rioting, and massacres of Korean immigrants took place across the country. This hostility against immigrants was in large part due to Korean dissidents who had been undertaking terrorist attacks across the country. In response, the Japanese government enacted security measures, including an increase in the country's internal security forces, the most notable and infamous of which was the Kenpei-tai, who were the military police arm of the army, but who also acted as the secret police within Japan itself, as well as its occupied territories. In 1926, the Japanese Emperor Yoshihito, the son of Emperor Meiji, died, and was replaced by his young and timid son, the 124th Emperor Hirohito, who would largely, due to his inexperience, come increasingly under the influence of the now powerful militarists within the Japanese government, particularly factions within the army and navy, through the country's Minister of War, who was only accountable to the emperor himself and had held a veto over all policy decisions within Japan since the turn of the century. In 1928, Tojo was promoted to the rank of colonel and placed in command of the 1st Infantry Regiment of the Imperial Army, and during this period he earned the respect and admiration of those under him, as he fostered close relations with his subordinate officers and became well respected for his organizational skills, as well as his insistence on the adoption of strict discipline. This in turn gained him another promotion in 1934 to the rank of Major General in the Personnel Department of the Army Ministry, which was the conduit between the army and the government. During this period, Tojo helped to write a book with other high-ranking Japanese officers, which was called Essays in a Time of National Emergency, in which Hideki and his peers called for the establishment of a national defensive state and also argued that Japanese soldiers were better than those of other nations such as Russia because they were a superior race of warriors. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Japan's government, because of the flaws in the Meiji Constitution, had been in an almost constant state of flux or upheaval that saw the country between 1900 and the outbreak of war in 1941 being led by a staggering 30 prime ministers of various parties and factions. Until 1932, however, the growing influence of the militarists within the upper echelons of the Japanese state had been kept in check. However, since the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty and the economic upheaval of the recession of the 1920s, combined with the Great Depression of the early 1930s, the nationalists and militarists had been calling for and plotting the overthrow of the civilian government and the installation of a military dictatorship. This culminated in the eventual assassination in 1932 of the country's then civilian Prime Minister, Inukai Tsuyoshi, who was shot dead by a number of young Navy officers. Due to popular support across the country, the perpetrators were given incredibly light sentences. Over time, this militaristic lobby within Japan, of which Tojo was a part, began exploiting and enhancing this growing nationalistic sentiment by drawing on Japan's ancient warrior culture, including the samurai as well as Bushido, twisting it into a propaganda tool that was used to foster a greater sense of national identity and militaristic zeal, in order to transform the country into a state that was geared to military conquest. The far-reaching consequences of adopting and incorporating such elements into the Japanese armed forces was seen as entirely necessary and logical during the early 1930s, as although Japan could not compete with its rivals in terms of industrial output, it could compete in the quality of its soldiers, or rather, in its soldiers' unflinching obedience and fearlessness in the face of Japan's enemies. That, in a short period of time, there would be plenty of. A large part of the resentment the growing militarist lobby within Japan held towards the West was its perception that Japan had time and time again been prevented from expanding its territories and creating its own Eastern Empire, which many within the country felt was its right and destiny. But also there were pragmatic strategic reasons for colonial expansion, as the Japanese home islands lacked vital commodities such as oil, natural gas, coal, iron, copper, and rubber, to name but a few. These aspirations for territory and resources that were meant to help propel Japan into a first-rate world power inevitably caused friction with other countries such as France, America, and Great Britain, who all had overseas colonies in East Asia and the Pacific, and naturally were wary of any potential challenge to their lucrative trade networks, especially from a country like Japan that had the potential to rival them militarily. This suspicion and resistance naturally angered the Japanese, who increasingly determined to pursue their own foreign policies in Asia regardless of the opinions of the Western powers and of what their reactions might be. This seemingly irresistible push towards the creation of a Japanese empire perhaps inevitably resulted in the country turning its attention to its neighbor China, or rather the Manchuria region, that Japan had been leased portions of after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. This included the rights to the operation of the South Manchurian branch of the Chinese Eastern Railway that extended over the border of the Japanese-held territory into China itself. This, in short, meant that Japanese troops were policing sections of the railway network within eastern China, and during this time, there were numerous reports of Japanese troops conducting raids on Chinese villages in the area, a practice becoming widespread within the Japanese army. An invasion of Manchuria was deemed desirable as soon as possible, especially as there were fears that Soviet Russia could annex the northern Chinese territory instead. Therefore, in 1931, a decision was taken by the commanders of the Japanese army in Manchuria, in defiance of the civilian government in Tokyo, to fake a sabotage attack on the railway by Chinese dissidents in order to force a reactionary invasion of Manchuria. After explosives were planted near a section of the railway by army sappers on the 18th of September 1931, they were detonated, and even though the explosives caused little to no damage, the Japanese army had fabricated the justification for the war it needed, in what is now known as the Mukden Incident. Over the coming weeks, imperial forces proceeded to occupy the whole of Manchuria. This largely independent action by a Japanese army of occupation goes to illustrate the considerable power and influence the country's armed forces had gained by the early 1930s, and perhaps emboldened by their successes combined with a near total lack of effective resistance both from within and outside Japan. Further plans for military expansion were put in place over the coming years. However, Japan's invasion of Manchuria led to widespread condemnation and criticism from the international community, and when the Chinese protested via the League of Nations, a report was published that blamed Japan for the outbreak of hostilities. Imperial delegates stormed out of the League of Nations, effectively meaning that any prospect of peace between Japan and China had now been lost, and as a consequence, the land of the rising sun was now more isolated and aggrieved than ever. In 1935, Tojo was posted to Manchuria as the commander of the now Japanese province's Kenpei-tai Secret Police Force, during which time he earned the nickname the Razor because of his proactive, decisive, and fastidious manner of command, and it was perhaps due to him being appointed to this post that Tojo would later expand the remit of the military police after his ascension to power, resulting in the organization becoming one of the most hated and feared instruments of state repression throughout Japan and its overseas colonies. As well as this, it is likely that Tojo's insistence in commanding the Kenpei-tai in Manchuria in a by-the-book fashion, in which he always adhered to the orders of those above him, that earned Tojo the admiration and praise of his superiors in Tokyo, that would over the coming years ensure he was given a steady stream of promotions, as the power and influence of the Japanese military increased yet further and the country plunged deeper and deeper towards war across Asia. Since the country's annexation of Manchuria, after which a puppet state had been set up named Manchu Kuo, under the rule of the deposed last emperor of China, Puyi, the Japanese army extended its control over an ever-increasing expanse of northern China.
A quick word from our sponsor, Guardio. Staying safe and protected is more important than ever. Phishing attacks are a daily threat, and many third parties are looking to exploit your data for their own profit. That's where Guardio comes in. Guardio is an easy-to-use browser extension that, simply put, keeps you safe from scams and identity theft so that you can do what you do online without worrying. Guardio blocks 100 times more sites and 10 times faster than competitors, so it's really the best way to keep safe online when all it takes is one wrong click to put your information and privacy at risk. Prevent unfortunate situations using Guardio, which is trusted by over 1 million users worldwide and has a perfect rating. You can monitor your accounts for leaks on any device and keep 5 members safe all under one account, all for an affordable price. Put your mind at ease and install Guardio today. Just click on the link in the video description. That's guard.io/peopleprofiles for full protection and a 20% discount on the monthly subscription.
China had overthrown Puyi in 1911 and was now headed by a Republican nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, who were fighting a civil war against the Chinese Communist Party. The Japanese, however, now sought to annex China themselves, which would, in time, weaken the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and allow the communists under Mao Zedong to eventually gain control of the whole of China after World War II. In the meantime, however, fearing a Japanese invasion, the nationalists agreed to a ceasefire and military alliance with the communists in 1936, so that China could effectively fight the foreign aggressor. This agreement was timely, as on the 7th of July 1937, Japanese troops that had by this time gained control of most of northeastern China without any resistance conducted a late-night military exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge in Peking, modern-day Beijing. After completing the exercise, the Japanese complained that one of their soldiers had not returned to their lines and demanded to be allowed to enter Chinese territory in order to search for him. This ultimatum was refused by the Chinese, and over the coming hours tensions between the two armies escalated until, at around 5 a.m. in the morning, gunfire broke out, and before long a full-scale battle had erupted between the Chinese and Japanese troops that eventually culminated in the capture of Peking along with the surrounding area. After this action, the Japanese were satisfied with their newly conquered territory. However, Chiang Kai-shek had other ideas and refused to capitulate to the invaders, resulting in the war escalating over the coming months until Nanking, now known as Nanjing, the then capital of China, was itself captured on the 13th of December 1937. Japanese troops, who were enraged by the ferocity of the resistance they encountered, embarked on a wholesale massacre of the city's population, in which hundreds of thousands of civilians, including women, children, and even babies, were butchered in what is now considered to be the greatest single war crime undertaken by the Japanese Empire. Tojo, who had by this time been promoted to Chief of Staff of the occupying army within China, turned a blind eye to the killings, as he did not publicly promote or dissuade his troops from killing civilians. However, his reluctance to intervene in the Nanking massacre would later be used against him after World War II, and despite the Land of the Rising Sun pouring more and more forces into China over the coming years, the country was never completely occupied, and the war would drag on until 1945, resulting in the deaths of around 30 million people, including 3 to 5 million Japanese casualties, dead, wounded, and captured, as well as over 10 million Chinese military casualties. In the meantime, Tojo, whose star was rising swiftly, was recalled to Japan in the May of 1938, where he was promoted to Vice Minister of War, as well as Inspector General of Army Aviation, and in 1940, when Tojo's political ally, Koichi Kido, was appointed to be Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, a position that essentially controlled what information the emperor was given and also who could obtain an audience with the emperor, Tojo was promoted to become Minister of War, effectively placing him in charge of the Japanese army and navy. Despite Tojo's rise to power, all was not well with the Japanese war effort, as during the summer of 1939, the country had been defeated in a large border skirmish against the Soviets along their northern Manchurian border. This caused the Japanese cabinet and war ministry to rethink their aggressive stance against the Soviets. Although this confrontation was relatively minor, the ramifications of the Japanese defeat would affect the outcome of the entire Second World War, as the country would 2 years later sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union on the 13th of April 1941 that essentially prevented the Japanese from attacking it during Germany's later invasion, which enabled Joseph Stalin to divert his Siberian divisions to the west, defeating the Germans on the outskirts of Moscow in the winter of 1941. The Russian border confrontations also caused divisions between the Japanese army and navy, as the army wanted revenge on the Soviets, whilst the navy saw expansion to the south as being the wiser course of action, as the majority of raw materials the Japanese war effort required were situated in South Asia, such as the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Therefore, as the time for war against Russia passed, and relations between the countries thawed, the army joined with the navy and resolved to undertake military expansion in the Pacific. The Japanese were also given fresh cause for optimism when Germany successfully defeated Western European allies in little more than 6 weeks during the summer of 1940, and with Britain seemingly on its knees and France dismembered, the Japanese government assumed the British Empire was about to collapse, and so chose to throw their lot in with Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, culminating in the Tripartite Pact in Berlin on the 27th of September 1940. This solidified the alliance of the Axis powers, in which Germany and Italy promised to respect Japanese territorial conquests in the Pacific, in return for Japan respecting both Italian and German conquests in Europe and North Africa. As well as this, all three countries began to cooperate with one another at an intelligence level. But crucially, the alliance between the Axis powers would remain a distant one, as Japan would, over the coming years, fight alone against the Allied powers in Asia, whilst Germany and Italy received little concrete help from the Japanese. However, after the fall of France, an agreement was struck with Germany and the French Vichy government that France's colonies in Indochina, that were comprised of modern-day Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, could be occupied by Japanese troops in July of 1941. The United States, however, protested against this move and, as a result, embargoed all exports of raw materials, including nearly 90% of Japan's oil supply, and refused to recommence exports until Japan withdrew from Indochina, meaning that Japan had to choose between further expansion to replace its lost imports of raw materials or retreat. As hardline ultra-nationalists were now in charge, the decision was taken to continue with a policy of military expansion to the south that would inevitably threaten the United States' own colonies in the Philippines, as well as Britain's imperial outposts in Hong Kong and Singapore. This embargo caused panic amongst the more moderate members of the Japanese government, who now argued that a peaceful resolution should be found with the United States. However, the militarists who controlled the Privy Council were strongly in favor of a declaration of war against the United States. An imperial conference was held on the 6th of September 1941, where it was agreed that a deadline should be set for a diplomatic solution with the United States that was to expire on the 14th of October, after which war would be inevitable. Negotiations continued into the autumn of 1941, in which Japan's Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe desperately tried to mediate via the US Embassy in Japan. But when the Americans demanded a total Japanese withdrawal from China and Manchuria in return for a resumption of exports, the Japanese felt they had no choice other than to declare war, as surrendering their conquests was not an option. And so, when the 14th of October deadline came and passed, Prime Minister Konoe resigned on the 16th. Acting on the advice of the Keeper of the Privy Seal, Koichi Kido, Hideki Tojo was summoned by the Emperor and asked to form a cabinet as Japan's new Prime Minister. The reasons for this appointment have been debated ever since. However, it is largely accepted that the Emperor wanted a soldier and not a civilian Prime Minister to lead Japan into war. And it is also claimed that of all the candidates, Tojo was the only man who could gain the support of the army and navy factions, as he agreed that war with the United States was now inevitable. After being ordered to conduct a review into the state of war preparations, Tojo finally told the Emperor that conflict with America was inevitable on the 2nd of November 1941, after which Hirohito gave his approval for hostilities to commence, and the next day plans for an audacious preemptive strike against the United States were shown to the Emperor, which involved an aircraft carrier-borne air raid on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At this stage, the prospects for success against America were seen as favorable, as in 1941, the Japanese Navy was the third largest in the world, consisting of a dozen battleships, 20 heavy and light aircraft carriers, over 50 cruisers, 350 destroyers and escort vessels, and around 200 submarines, all of which were concentrated in the Pacific theater. In contrast, Japan's two great rivals for domination of the seas in the East, Britain and America, were forced to disperse their naval forces across the globe, meaning that at this time Japan would enjoy naval supremacy anywhere in the Pacific, providing it struck quickly and in force. Preparations for the attack on Hawaii were then finalized with the Emperor's approval by the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, that involved a massive naval task force attacking Pearl Harbor, along with simultaneous invasions of British and American colonies in the Western Pacific, with a view to ultimately seizing the South Asian oil fields that were to replace the lost American imports. And so, on the 26th of November 1941, a large naval fleet set sail from the Japanese home islands under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and headed east across the northern Pacific, before turning south towards the Hawaiian archipelago, before finally attacking the islands on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, resulting in over a dozen US ships being sunk or badly damaged. 3 days later, on the 11th of December 1941, Germany and Italy joined with their Japanese allies and declared war on the United States, which, in effect, sealed their doom, as the world's richest and most powerful industrial nation had now joined the conflict, with whom the Axis powers would soon realize they could not hope to compete. Spurred on by the success of the Japanese Navy, the Imperial Army now also embarked on a whirlwind advance through Southeast Asia, in which Hong Kong, the Philippines, Borneo and Malaya were captured, and in February of 1942 the vital British outpost of Singapore was also taken, effectively making Japan the dominant power in Asia as well as the Western Pacific. These victories marked the high watermark of Japanese expansion in the Pacific, and in Japan itself, Tojo was hailed as a hero by a jubilant population. However, the man himself was far more subdued than the rest of the Japanese population, as he knew his country had not yet delivered a knockout blow against the United States. Soon after this, Tojo was shown to be correct in his reluctance to celebrate, as the Japanese population was then shaken out of its complacency when the Americans bombed Japan on the 18th of April 1942 in what is now known as the Doolittle Raid, in which 16 aircraft carrier-borne B-25B Mitchell bombers undertook a daring strike on the Greater Tokyo area. These raids shook the Japanese people's perception of invincibility to its core, and after the attack, a number of American pilots who were shot down during the raid were taken prisoner, 3 of whom were executed in reprisal on the Emperor's orders against Tojo's advice, as he argued that killing prisoners of war would risk the Americans doing the same to Japanese prisoners. This action flies in the face of the modern perception of Hideki Tojo, which labels him as a hardliner within the Japanese government. And there are also accounts of him going to great lengths to see that the Japanese people were not suffering too much due to the war effort, as during this time he would often, whilst driving through Tokyo, stop and check the rubbish bins outside ordinary people's houses so he could ascertain what food they were eating. Great lengths were also taken to portray Tojo as a benevolent father figure in the now state-controlled media, whose only concern was the care and protection of the Japanese homeland, and in an effort to garner support from the people and countries of Asia, Tojo promoted the idea of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that involved the Japanese leading a collection of free Asian states, or as the West saw it, Japanese puppet states that would join together to throw the Western powers out of Asia. Although he was portrayed at the time, and is still seen by some in Japan today, as being a protector of Asians throughout the world, there was a darker, more pragmatic side to Tojo's premiership, as during the war, all radio broadcasts and newspaper articles were subject to strict censorship, although this was not as wide-reaching or as extreme as in Nazi Germany. Even so, around 4,000 to 5,000 people were arrested and imprisoned during the conflict, for what was called thought crimes against the state, and in many cases, extreme measures such as torture were used to extract confessions by the Kenpei-tai secret police that Tojo controlled. This insistence on submission and order especially extended to the military, as adherence to the way of the warrior was literally beaten into Japanese soldiers from the outset of their training, in which all individualism was crushed and replaced with a mindset of total obedience to the emperor. At Tojo's command, every Japanese soldier was issued with a written copy of the military code of conduct, known as the Senjin-kun, which was heavily inspired by elements of Bushido, as it stated that surrender was not allowed under any circumstances. However, the increasing reverence to the way of the warrior, that after all was born out of feudal Japan, would, during World War II, come to have both positive and negative outcomes for the Japanese, as the fearless, disciplined warriors that this modern interpretation of Bushido helped to produce proved themselves to be capable of superhuman feats during battle. On the flip side, it also made Japanese soldiers extremely intolerant of enemy prisoners of war, as well as foreigners in general. One of the most notable incidents of the mistreatment and even murder of prisoners of war by the Japanese was the Bataan Death March of April 1942, during which American and Filipino prisoners were marched for almost 70 miles in searing heat across Bataan in the Philippines, resulting in between 5,000 and 18,000 men dying of exhaustion, lack of water, and by execution. Another example of the Japanese army's mistreatment of prisoners comes from the infamous building of the Burma Railway that involved as many as 250,000 local civilians and Allied prisoners constructing over 250 miles of narrow-gauge railway in tropical heat across Japanese-occupied Burma in little over a year between 1942 and 1943 that resulted in the deaths of nearly 100,000 men from dysentery, beatings, beheading, exhaustion, and starvation. A stark statistic regarding the death toll of Allied prisoners is that 27% of all prisoners of war died under Japanese care, whilst in Europe the figure was around 6%. However, Tojo himself claimed during his trial that the mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war was the responsibility of commanders in the field and not himself, although once again he and his government could have stopped the abuse and killings had they so wished. Indeed, the true number of prisoners of war and civilians who were killed by the Japanese during the 1930s and 1940s is widely considered to be at the very least in the region of 3 million people, especially in China and Manchuria, whilst higher estimates state that the actual number of dead is far closer to 14 million, which is more than double the amount killed during the Holocaust. Another largely negative consequence of the Japanese military's obsession with never surrendering to the enemy, or viewing defeat as the ultimate dishonor, would, as World War II proceeded, or rather regressed from the Japanese perspective, result in Japanese soldiers embarking on suicidal attacks against Allied forces, or even in committing suicide without ever attacking the enemy, if the commanders and troops in question felt that a battle was lost. This, in essence, showed the flaws of implementing ancient warrior codes of conduct and morality within modern warfare, as in many instances the Japanese army and navy would embark in all-out suicidal attacks on Allied troops and shipping during World War II, rather than considering the far more effective and pragmatic solutions of fighting withdrawals or even full-scale retreats that would perhaps be considered dishonorable by some, but in the long run may have borne strategic and tactical fruit. To counter this, it could be said that as many of the battles the Japanese army were involved in during World War II were on small archipelagos or island chains, fighting to the last man was in many ways inevitable, given that retreat was impossible, as Japan lost naval and air supremacy over the majority of the Pacific by 1943. However, it is hard to justify large numbers of Japanese troops embarking in suicidal attacks, or rather in the Japanese government, including Hideki Tojo, in sanctioning such attacks when those in power in Japan knew full well the war against America was lost from relatively early on. The first and possibly the largest hammer blow the Japanese suffered before 1945 then came in the South Pacific in June of 1942 at the Battle of Midway, when the United States Pacific Fleet effectively destroyed the Japanese first carrier striking force that lost all 4 of its largest aircraft carriers, along with 248 aircraft and over 3,000 personnel during the battle. This defeat is widely considered to be the turning point of the Pacific War, as the whole Japanese war effort in World War II depended on naval and air supremacy, which in a relatively short period of time it proved to be unable to bring about. Therefore, the bravery and fanaticism of its armies and soldiers was made relevant after the Battle of Midway, as the United States was from then on able to attack any Japanese territory with overwhelming forces without effective reply. Instead of taking back all of the Japanese gains, the Americans saw the best route to victory in taking back a series of strategically vital islands in the Eastern Pacific, which came to be known as island hopping, that would eventually bring their naval and air forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. After the defeat at Midway, the Japanese Navy attempted to prevent the scale of the losses it had incurred from becoming public knowledge, and staggeringly, even Tojo himself was not informed of the disaster for nearly 2 weeks after the last Japanese carrier had disappeared below the waves. However, when he did hear of the calamity, Tojo ordered that conscription should be increased so that every healthy man was brought into the armed forces. This belated effort to swell the numbers of men in the Japanese armed forces had little effect, however, as it was Japan's inability to compete with Allied industrial might that lay at the heart of its reversals, and as well as this, Tojo was constantly hindered by the widespread infighting and squabbling that became increasingly rife throughout the military and government, as navy and army factions fought one another for supremacy and resources. By 1944, the war situation across the Pacific was grim to say the least, as the Americans, led by General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, began to close the noose around the neck of the land of the rising sun by invading and successfully occupying Saipan, during which the Japanese defenders mounted desperate massed banzai or suicide charges that resulted in nearly 30,000 deaths, including mass suicides of soldiers as well as civilians. This defeat meant that the Americans were now able to mount bombing raids on Japan itself and across the country. The population was prepared for the oncoming onslaught, even though the majority of Japanese houses were made of wood, making them particularly vulnerable to incendiary bombing and resulting firestorms. After Saipan, Tojo was blamed for the defeat, and seeing his premiership as an obstacle to a possible peace with the Allies, a powerful lobby began to form within the Japanese government for his removal, prompting the Prime Minister to seek the Emperor's backing, which was not given. Therefore, seeing no other course of action, Hideki Tojo then resigned as Prime Minister of Japan on the 18th of July 1944. Although his policies had undoubtedly led to his expulsion, Tojo was not publicly blamed or shamed for the loss of Saipan, and afterwards remained a loyal servant of the Emperor, explaining in his farewell radio broadcast that he was saddened at the worry and stress the war had caused his master. But despite this, and the growing number of devastating air raids across Japan, Tojo continued to advocate his former policy of no surrender. But even he could not have imagined the colossal blow that would, within a year of his dismissal, bring about Japan's final subjugation. By the summer of 1945, the Americans had now occupied a number of the Japanese home islands, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa, enabling them on the 6th of August 1945 to unleash their secret weapon, an atomic bomb, that was first dropped on the coastal city of Hiroshima, and then, 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, culminating in the Japanese Empire surrendering to the Allies unconditionally on the 14th of August 1945. Tojo, who until now had been in retirement, was largely blamed in the West for starting the war, and was now faced with the decision his own policies had forced on hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, that being surrender or death. After the Americans began to occupy Japan in late August of 1945, Tojo prepared his final will and political testament. Then, on the 11th of September 1945, when American military police surrounded Tojo's house, he greeted them from a window and then slammed it shut, and shortly afterwards, a gunshot was heard. Tojo had fired a pistol bullet into his chest, but it had missed his heart, and whilst he lay bleeding, beside him a note was found in which the former Prime Minister acknowledged that he had been responsible for the war. However, no doubt to his dismay, the attending doctors were able to bring him back from death over the coming days, until within a matter of weeks he was well on the way to making a full recovery. Once he had regained his health, Tojo was sent to prison to await trial for war crimes along with a number of other high-ranking Japanese generals and officials, until in late April of 1946, proceedings began in which 28 defendants, most of whom came from Tojo's war cabinet, were charged on 55 separate counts, those being of Class A war crimes, Class B conventional war crimes, and Class C crimes against humanity. When he was finally called to give his testimony in 1947, Tojo presented the tribunal with his affidavit, in which he laid out his version of events up to and during his tenure as Prime Minister, and accepted that he had been responsible for starting the war, but claimed that hostilities were necessary as America had forced Japan to defend itself with its hostile foreign policy, including the buildup of naval forces at Pearl Harbor and its punitive embargoes of raw materials. The prosecution that was led by the former U.S. Attorney General of Ohio, Joseph Keenan, who had formerly overseen the prosecutions of some of America's most notorious gangsters, including Machine Gun Kelly and Al Capone, rejected Tojo's claims as militaristic propaganda and presented the tribunal with evidence that Tojo had been fully aware of the mistreatment of prisoners and civilians by the Japanese army in so-called Class B war crimes. In response, Tojo rejected Keenan's accusations, as he claimed that killing people in wartime could hardly be seen as criminal. However, both he and his fellow defendants unanimously accepted that starting the war had been their decision, and continually stated that the Emperor Hirohito had only approved the instigation of hostilities due to their advice. This was the militarists' last act of service to their master, as to them, the Emperor was still, after all, a living god, who was blameless and above reproach. Therefore, they saw it as their patriotic duty to deflect all blame from Hirohito, even though he had had the final say on nearly every major strategic decision the Japanese made during World War II. Another reason that Hirohito was never blamed for Japanese aggression or war crimes was that the commander of US forces in Japan, Douglas MacArthur, had decided that the Emperor's help and therefore survival was essential in order to subjugate the Japanese population, as putting Hirohito on trial or even convicting him would have potentially resulted in a mass uprising against the occupying Americans. The decision was therefore taken before the trial that the militarists and in particular Tojo himself were to bear the brunt of the blame for Japan's actions during the war, and therefore it could be said that in many ways the tribunal was unfair or was rigged, as not all those responsible were put on trial, and those who were had effectively been judged and sentenced before proceedings began. The tribunal dragged on until 1948, when, on the 12th of November, Hideki Tojo, along with 6 of his co-defendants, was sentenced to death, and over a month later, he was hanged on the 23rd of December, 1948. Before his death, Tojo issued a statement in which he apologized for the crimes Japan had committed against Allied soldiers and civilians and begged the Americans to show the Japanese people mercy. After the execution, Tojo's body was cremated, after which orders were given to scatter the ashes in secret. However, Japanese patriots obtained the remains of their former prime minister and his fellow defendants, and over the coming years, several shrines were constructed across Japan, where even today prayers are offered for the dead men's souls. In recent years, Hideki Tojo and his like have come to be seen by some as victims, as many Japanese believe that Tojo's assertion that Japan was forced into war with America as an act of self-defense was the truth, and also believed that at his trial he was made a scapegoat by the Americans who wanted to portray the Japanese as villains. The belief is angrily disputed by many of Japan's neighbors, and also many people in Japan itself still blame and even hate Hideki Tojo for starting a war Japan had no hope of winning, that resulted in the deaths of 2 to 3 million Japanese soldiers and civilians, as well as tens of millions from the lands conquered. Most historians agree that Hideki Tojo was not a dictator such as Adolf Hitler, as he was, after all, merely the Prime Minister of Japan. However, there is a consensus he did play a crucial role in the instigation of World War II in the Pacific and in advocating the adoption of a brutal warrior code within the Japanese military. Tojo helped to create the mindset that would lead to many of the atrocities that were perpetrated by Japanese armed forces across Asia and the Pacific during the Second World War. What do you think of Hideki Tojo? Was he an aggressive militarist and war criminal who wanted to form a Japanese colonial empire by brutal means? Or was he simply a humble servant of Emperor Hirohito who ordered an attack on the United States as an act of self-defense and was, after the war, unfairly used as a scapegoat by both his own countrymen and the wider world? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.